Before we begin, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel right now. Then, drop a comment below telling me what city, state, or country you are watching from. Because what you are about to hear is the true story of a unit so dangerous, so effective, and so far ahead of its time that the United States military tried to forget it ever existed. This is the story of 40 men pulled from prisons and punishment details, forged into an elite killing force, and sent on a mission that would change the course of the Pacific War. Their tactics became the foundation of modern special operations. Their sacrifice has been buried for decades. This is the Battle of Saipan. This is the legend of the 40 thieves. The bodies were still washing ashore when the orders came down. November 1943, Tarawa Atoll. The United States Marine Corps had just suffered one of the most catastrophic amphibious assaults in American military history. In 76 hours of unrelenting combat, nearly 3,400 Marines had been killed or wounded storming a coral island barely 3 miles long. The Japanese had fortified Battalion Island with interlocking fields of fire, reinforced bunkers, and a defensive doctrine that demanded every man fight to the death. The Marines had walked into a slaughterhouse. Admiral Chester Nimitz himself stood on the blood-soaked beaches and wept. The American public reeled in shock. Newspaper photographs showed bloated corpses floating in the surf, young men who had drowned under the weight of their own equipment before they ever reached the sand. Mothers across the United States opened telegrams and collapsed. The Marine Corps, proud and defiant, faced a brutal reckoning. Something had gone catastrophically wrong. The intelligence had been incomplete. The preparatory bombardment had been ineffective. The coordination between naval gunfire and ground assault had failed. But more than that, the Marines had learned a terrible lesson. They were fighting an enemy that would never surrender, that would use every cave and pillbox and trench as a tomb, and that would exact a horrifying price for every yard of ground. The Pacific Island hopping campaign stretched ahead like a corridor of fire, and Tarawa was only the beginning. If the Corps continued to assault fortified positions with the same tactics, the casualty rates would become unsustainable. There had to be another way. In the aftermath, senior officers gathered in smoke-filled command tents and pored over maps of the Mariana Islands. Saipan loomed large. It was a strategic prize, a stepping stone toward the Japanese home islands, and intelligence suggested it was heavily defended. The invasion was already being planned. June 1944. But this time, the Marine Corps could not afford another Tarawa. They needed information. They needed to know where the Japanese positions were before the main assault forces hit the beaches. They needed eyes deep behind enemy lines, men who could move through hostile territory undetected, report enemy strength and disposition, and guide artillery strikes with surgical precision. They needed scouts. They needed snipers. They needed ghosts. The idea came from an unlikely source. Lieutenant Frank Taxke, a young officer with the 2nd Marine Division, had been thinking about reconnaissance differently. The Marine Corps had scout units, but they operated close to friendly lines, gathering tactical information in the immediate battle space. Taxke envisioned something more radical. He imagined small teams of highly skilled men moving deep into enemy-held territory, living off the land, avoiding contact when possible, striking lethally when necessary, and radioing back intelligence that could shape the entire battle. He imagined men who could think for themselves, who did not need orders for every decision, who could survive alone in the jungle with nothing but their wits and their weapons. The Marine Corps was built on discipline, on following orders, on the rigid hierarchy of command. Taxke wanted to build a unit that thrived on initiative. He wanted pirates. He wanted outlaws. He wanted the kind of men who could not be broken because they had already been broken and put themselves back together. So he went to the brigs. He went to the punishment details. He went to the disciplinary battalions where the Marine Corps warehoused its misfits, its troublemakers, its hard cases. These were men who had fought with superior officers, who had gone absent without leave, who had brawled in bars and defied regulations and refused to bow to authority. They were men the Corps had given up on, but Taksky saw something else. He saw aggression. He saw independence. He saw men who would not quit, who would not follow a bad order just because it came from a higher rank, who would do whatever it took to survive. He saw warriors. One by one, he pulled them out. He offered them a deal. Join his experimental platoon, survive the training, prove yourself in combat, and your record would be cleared. Refuse, and you stay in the brig. It was not a choice. It was a chance. They came from everywhere. Farm boys from the Midwest who had never seen the ocean before they enlisted. Street fighters from Brooklyn and Chicago who knew how to move through hostile territory because they had grown up in it. Men who had been dishonorably discharged from other units and given one final opportunity. Men who had nothing to lose. Taksky assembled 40 of them. 40 thieves, the other Marines called them, and the name stuck. They were not trusted. They were not respected. They were despised. The regular infantry units looked at them with contempt. These were criminals, washouts, men who had disgraced the uniform. But Taksky did not care about their reputations. He cared about their skills, and he knew that if he could forge them into a cohesive unit, they would be unstoppable. The training began at Camp Tarawa on the Big Island of Hawaii. The camp was a sprawl of tents and temporary structures carved out of volcanic rock and jungle, a brutal environment that mirrored the islands they would soon be fighting for. Taksky did not ease them into it. From the first day, he pushed them beyond exhaustion. They ran through the jungle at night with full packs, learning to navigate by starlight and instinct. They practiced camouflage until they could disappear into the vegetation, becoming invisible even at close range. They learned to move without sound, controlling their breathing, placing each footstep with deliberate care, becoming part of the jungle itself. They studied Japanese tactics, Japanese fortifications, Japanese weapons. They learned to recognize the sound of enemy mortars, the cadence of Japanese machine gun fire, the silhouette of enemy soldiers in the dark. They trained with every weapon they could get their hands on. The Springfield 1903 rifle, the standard Marine sniper weapon, accurate out to 800 yards. The Browning automatic rifle for close support. The Thompson submachine gun for tight quarters. Grenades, knives, garrotes. They learned to kill silently, efficiently, without hesitation. But the most important part of the training was mental. Taksky drilled into them the reality of what they would be doing. They would not be fighting alongside battalions of Marines with artillery support and air cover. They would be alone, miles behind enemy lines, surrounded, outnumbered, with no guarantee of rescue. If they were wounded, they would have to treat themselves. If they were compromised, they would have to fight their way out or die trying. There would be no one coming to save them. They had to be self-reliant, adaptable, and utterly ruthless. Fear was acceptable. Panic was death. Hesitation was death. They learned to trust each other because there was no one else to trust. The rivalries and resentments that had defined them in their old units began to fade. They were no longer individuals. They were a platoon. They were the 40 Thieves. By the spring of 1944, they were ready. The invasion of Saipan was imminent. Intelligence reports painted a grim picture. The island was 15 miles long and 5 miles wide, dominated by rugged terrain, dense jungle, and volcanic ridges. The Japanese had turned it into a fortress. Approximately 30,000 troops defended the island, a mix of seasoned Imperial Army soldiers and naval infantry. They had dug in deeply, creating a network of bunkers, trenches, and artillery positions that covered every approach. They had coastal guns, anti-aircraft batteries, and a significant armored force. The Japanese command had declared Saipan the absolute line of defense. If it fell, American bombers would be within range of the Japanese home islands. Tokyo would burn. The Japanese garrison had orders to fight to the last man, and American intelligence knew they would. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, along with the Army's 27th Infantry Division, would assault the island in a massive amphibious operation. Tens of thousands of men would pour onto the beaches in a coordinated strike designed to overwhelm the defenses through sheer force. But before that could happen, the 40 Thieves would go in first. June 15, 1944. 05:30 hours. The sky over Saipan was still dark, the horizon just beginning to pale with the false dawn. The naval bombardment had been pounding the island for hours, the heavy guns of battleships and cruisers hurling shells into the jungle, trying to soften the defenses before the first wave hit the beaches. The sound was beyond description, a continuous rolling thunder that shook the air and the sea, a mechanical storm that drowned out thought. The 40 Thieves crouched in their landing craft, packed shoulder to shoulder, their faces streaked with camouflage paint, their weapons wrapped in cloth to keep the sand and salt water out. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. Each man was alone with his thoughts, with his fear, with the knowledge that in minutes they would be stepping into hell. The landing craft churned through the water, rising and falling with the swells, the diesel engines roaring, the spray cold against their skin. Lieutenant Taksky stood at the front, his eyes fixed on the dark mass of the island ahead. He had trained these men. He had shaped them. He had promised them that if they followed him, they would survive. Now he would find out if that promise meant anything. The ramp dropped. The beach was chaos. Artillery shells were still falling inland, throwing up geysers of dirt and vegetation. Machine gun fire chattered from hidden positions. Mortar rounds walked across the sand, searching for targets. The 40 Thieves poured out of the landing craft and ran. They did not bunch up. They did not hesitate. They moved like they had been trained, spreading out, using every crater and rise for cover, advancing in short bursts, their eyes scanning for threats. The beach was littered with obstacles, twisted metal and sharpened stakes designed to gut landing craft and impale men. Bodies were already accumulating, Marines from the first wave who had been cut down before they reached the tree line. The Thieves did not stop to help. Their mission was not to secure the beach. Their mission was to get inland, to disappear into the jungle, and to find the enemy before the enemy found the main force. They ran through the smoke and the fire, through the screaming and the explosions, and within minutes they had crossed the beach and plunged into the dense vegetation beyond. The jungle swallowed them. The noise of the beach faded, replaced by the hum of insects and the distant crack of gunfire. The air was thick, humid, suffocating. The undergrowth was a tangle of vines and thorns that tore at their uniforms and skin. They moved in a loose line, maintaining visual contact but staying spread out, their weapons at the ready. Taksky led them north, away from the main axis of advance, into territory that no other Marine unit had reached. The plan was simple: push as deep as possible, find the Japanese positions, report back, survive. They moved fast, covering ground at a pace that would have been reckless for a conventional unit. But they were not conventional, they were scouts. They were hunters, and they knew that speed was their best defense. If they stayed ahead of the enemy's reaction, if they kept moving, they would be ghosts, invisible, untouchable. By midday, they had advanced farther inland than any other Marine unit on the island. They were miles ahead of the front lines, deep in enemy territory, and they had not made contact. It was eerie. The jungle was full of signs of the Japanese presence: foxholes, supply caches, freshly dug trenches, but no soldiers. Taksky knew what that meant. The Japanese were pulling back, consolidating their forces, preparing a defense in depth. They were letting the Marines come to them. And when the Marines advanced into the kill zone, the Japanese would annihilate them, unless the Thieves found those positions first. They moved slower now, more carefully. Every step was deliberate. They watched for tripwires, for camouflaged bunkers, for the glint of a rifle barrel in the shadows. They listened to the jungle, to the birds and the insects, because when those sounds stopped it meant something else was nearby. They smelled the air, searching for the scent of cooking fires or cigarette smoke or human waste. They used every sense, every instinct, every bit of training, and then they found it. A massive fortified position carved into a hillside, invisible from the air, invisible from the beach, but from their position on the ridge they could see it clearly. Bunkers reinforced with coconut logs and coral stone, machine gun nests with overlapping fields of fire, mortar pits, artillery emplacements, and soldiers, hundreds of them. Taxki pulled out his map and marked the position. He radioed back to the division command post, gave the coordinates, and requested a fire mission. Within minutes, naval gunfire began to rain down on the position. The Thieves watched from a distance as the shells tore through the jungle, obliterating bunkers and scattering troops. It was brutal, efficient, and it saved the lives of countless Marines who would have walked into that ambush. They continued deeper. Over the next 2 days, they found position after position. They called in strikes. They mapped the Japanese defensive network. They became the eyes of the division, feeding intelligence back to commanders who used it to shape the entire assault. The regular infantry units pushed forward with confidence because the Thieves had already cleared the path. But the deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. They were running low on water. Their rations were almost gone. They had not slept in over 48 hours, and they were starting to encounter Japanese patrols. The first contact was brief, brutal. A squad of enemy soldiers moving through the jungle unaware they were being watched. The Thieves let them pass, then ambushed them from behind. It was over in seconds. Silent kills. No shots fired. The bodies were dragged into the undergrowth and the Thieves kept moving. But now the Japanese knew someone was out there. The patrols became more frequent, more cautious. The Thieves had to move faster, quieter, smarter. On the 3rd day, they found something that changed everything. They had pushed to the eastern side of the island, moving through a valley thick with vegetation when one of the scouts spotted movement ahead. Taxki signaled for the platoon to halt. They crouched in the undergrowth, absolutely still, and waited. And then they saw it. Tanks. Not 1 or 2. Dozens. A full Japanese armored battalion hidden in a grove of trees, the tanks camouflaged with branches and netting, invisible from the air. Type 97 medium tanks, armed with 47mm guns and machine guns. They were positioned for a counterattack, waiting for the order to roll down into the Marine lines and crush the invasion before it could gain a foothold. Taxki felt his blood turn cold. If those tanks hit the beaches, they would slaughter the Marines. The infantry had no heavy anti-tank weapons. The artillery was still being unloaded. The Marines would be overrun. He had to warn them. He had to get this information back. But he also knew that the moment he radioed, the Japanese would triangulate his position. They would know the Thieves were there, and they would come for them. Taxki made the call. He radioed the coordinates of the tank battalion back to division. He described the number, the type, the disposition. He requested immediate airstrikes and naval gunfire, and then he told his men to prepare to move, fast, because in minutes the Japanese were going to know exactly where they were. The response from division was immediate. Taxki could hear the tension in the radio man's voice. Confirmed. Air support en route. Hold position if possible. Taxki almost laughed. Hold position. They were 40 men surrounded by 30,000 enemy soldiers. They were miles from friendly lines. They had just revealed the location of the enemy's strategic reserve. Holding position was suicide. He gave the order, fall back, move south, fast and quiet, get back to friendly lines. The platoon broke into a run. They had barely gone half a mile when the Japanese attacked. It was not a patrol. It was a company-strength force, over 100 men, moving through the jungle with purpose. The thieves were spotted. Shouts went up. Rifle fire cracked through the trees. Tatsuki screamed for his men to scatter, to use the jungle to make themselves hard targets. The platoon fragmented into small teams, each one moving independently, firing and maneuvering, trying to break contact. The jungle erupted into chaos. Bullets snapped through the foliage. Grenades exploded. Men screamed. The thieves returned fire, short controlled bursts, aiming for sound and movement, trying to slow the pursuit. But the Japanese kept coming. They had numbers. They had momentum. And they wanted blood. One of the thieves went down, hit in the leg. 2 others grabbed him and dragged him into cover. They wrapped a tourniquet around his thigh and kept moving. Another man took a round through the shoulder and kept firing, his face twisted in pain but his hand steady. The platoon was hemorrhaging men, but they were still moving, still fighting. Tatsuki led a corps group south, toward where he hoped the Marine lines would be. But the jungle was disorienting. Every direction looked the same. The sun was hidden by the canopy. He navigated by instinct, by memory, by desperation. Behind them, the Japanese were closing in. He could hear them crashing through the undergrowth, their officers shouting commands. The thieves set up hasty ambushes, killing pursuers and buying time, but it was not enough. They were being hunted. And then the tanks came. The sound was unmistakable, the grinding roar of engines, the clank of treads. The Japanese had launched their counterattack. The armored battalion that the thieves had discovered was rolling down toward the Marine lines, and the thieves were directly in their path. Tatsuki realized with a sickening clarity that they had run straight into the middle of a tank assault. The first Type 97 crashed through the trees 50 yards to their left, its turret swiveling, searching for targets. The thieves hit the ground. They had no anti-tank weapons, no bazookas, no mines. All they had were rifles and grenades and the will to survive. The tank rolled past, oblivious, followed by infantry. Japanese soldiers moving in the wake of the armor, using the tanks as cover. The thieves let them pass, praying they would not be spotted. But one of the Japanese soldiers saw movement. He raised his rifle. A thief shot him. The sound was like a crack of lightning. Every head turned. The Japanese infantry opened fire. The thieves were caught in the open. It was a slaughter. The Japanese poured fire into their position. The thieves returned fire, but they were outnumbered 10-1. Men fell. Tatsuki saw one of his best scouts take a round through the throat, blood spraying, his body jerking and then going still. Another man was hit in the chest, the impact throwing him backward into the dirt. Tatsuki screamed for his men to fall back, to get out, to run. The survivors scattered into the jungle, moving in ones and twos, abandoning their dead, abandoning their wounded, just trying to stay alive. Tatsuki ran with 3 other men, crashing through the undergrowth, branches whipping his face, his lungs burning. Behind him, the battle raged. He could hear the tanks firing, the deep boom of their guns, the chatter of machine guns. The Marine lines were under assault, and the thieves were trapped between the Japanese advance and their own forces. They ran for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, and then miraculously they broke through. They stumbled out of the jungle and into a clearing, and there, dug in behind a low ridge, were Marines, American Marines, the 4th Division. Tatsuki shouted the password, his voice hoarse, his hands raised. The Marines held their fire. Tatsuki and the 3 men with him collapsed behind the line, gasping for air, shaking with adrenaline. Tatsuki looked back at the jungle. How many had made it out? He did not know. He could not know. All he knew was that the Japanese tanks were coming, and the Marines had minutes to prepare. He found the nearest company commander, a captain, and told him everything. Tanks, at least 40 of them coming from the north. Infantry support, maybe 1,000 men. The captain's face went white. He grabbed his radio and started shouting orders. Artillery, air support, every gun they had. Taxki watched as the Marine line transformed. Machine guns were repositioned. Mortar crews ranged their targets. Riflemen fixed bayonets. And then the tanks arrived. They came out of the jungle like iron monsters, their guns blazing, their treads crushing everything in their path. The Marines opened fire. It was the loudest thing Taxki had ever heard, every weapon firing at once, artillery shells screaming in from the rear, naval gunfire walking across the Japanese formation. The tanks burned. The infantry died. The Japanese attack broke apart under the sheer weight of American firepower. But it was close. If the thieves had not found that tank battalion, if they had not radioed the warning, if the Marines had not had time to prepare, the entire beachhead could have been overrun. The battle raged into the night. Taxki collapsed behind the line, too exhausted to move. Other members of the platoon trickled in throughout the evening. Some were wounded, some were in shock, some never came back. By the time the sun rose on June 16th, Taxki had counted his men, 23 out of 40. The rest were dead or missing. The 40 thieves had been gutted, but they had done their job. They had pushed farther inland than any other unit. They had found the enemy positions. They had called in the strikes that saved hundreds, maybe thousands of Marine lives. They had discovered the tank battalion and given the division time to prepare. They had fought and bled and died in the dark places where no one would see them. They were ghosts. They were thieves. They were heroes. The Battle of Saipan would rage for another 3 weeks. The Japanese fought with fanatical determination, launching banzai charges, suicide attacks, and desperate counteroffensives. The Marines took the island yard by yard, cave by cave, paying in blood for every inch of ground. When it was over, nearly 3,000 Americans were dead and over 10,000 wounded. Almost the entire Japanese garrison was killed. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War, but the 40 thieves were not there to see the end. Their mission was over. The survivors were pulled off the line and sent back to Hawaii. They were exhausted. They were traumatized. They were shadows of the men who had landed on that beach. But they had proven something. They had proven that a small unit of highly trained, highly motivated men could operate independently behind enemy lines and change the course of a battle. They had proven that initiative and aggression mattered more than rigid discipline. They had proven that the misfits and the outlaws and the troublemakers could be forged into an elite force. The Marine Corps studied their tactics. The lessons learned from the 40 thieves influenced the development of reconnaissance units throughout the Pacific. After the war, those lessons were passed on. The concept of small, independent teams operating behind enemy lines became the foundation of modern special operations. The Navy SEALs, the Army Rangers, the Marine Force Reconnaissance, all of them owe a debt to the 40 thieves, but the platoon itself was forgotten. The men were scattered to other units. The records were filed away. The story was buried. For decades, almost no one knew they had existed. Lieutenant Frank Taxki survived the war. He never spoke much about Saipan. The men who served with him carried the memories alone, the weight of what they had done and what they had lost. Some drank themselves to death. Some woke up screaming every night for the rest of their lives. Some just disappeared, unable to reconcile the men they had been with the men the war had made them. They were thieves. They stole victory from the jaws of defeat. They stole time for their brothers to prepare. They stole life from the enemy and gave it to their fellow Marines, and history stole their story. But their legacy endures. Every time a SEAL team inserts into hostile territory, every time a reconnaissance Marine moves silent and unseen through enemy lines, every time a small unit of Americans does the impossible against overwhelming odds, The spirit of the 40 Thieves is there. They were the first. They were the prototype. They were proof that courage and skill and sheer bloody-minded determination can change the world. They were 40 men who should have been forgotten. 40 criminals and misfits given one last chance, and they became legends. So I am asking you now, subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, because stories like this need to be told. These men deserve to be remembered. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from, your city, your state, your country. Tell me what you think of this story. Tell me if you had ever heard of the 40 Thieves before today. And let me ask you this. What does it say about leadership, about sacrifice, about the nature of heroism, that the men who changed the course of the war were the ones the military had given up on? What does it say about us that we forgot them? Think about that. And remember their names. Remember the 40 Thieves.